Yeah, thank you very much. These have been excellent presentations, from everything from tutoring systems to adaptive systems to nudging systems. Quite intriguing. I'm going to talk a little bit today about instructional designers and trying to bring instructional designers into the mix when it comes to adaptation and when it comes to learning analytics. And maybe if I could just have a raise of hands of people who consider themselves instructional designers or have some instructional design background, some training in this. Okay, great. So learning analytics, we've heard a lot, I guess, at this conference and at previous conferences. The goal tends to be the predictive model. We want to understand students. We want to predict what their outcomes are going to be, their learning outcomes. Usually this means we want to know what their grades are going to be, and then we want to do something about it. But a lot of questions exist around this. Who finds these models and verifies that they're pedagogically sound? And in part that is predicting marks really predicting learning, and is that something that we're interested in doing exclusively, a prediction of marks, retention, and alumni dollars, or is there something more to learning than those? Who intervenes when the models are assigned to learners? And we actually saw some great stuff on automated systems for nudging learners. That works in a number of broad cases. In some very specific cases, it might not, and it might be very tied to the content of your class. You can't just say, oh, listen, you need to work harder. It's, no, you have to go talk to this tutor, or you need to see content in a different way. And are there course-specific requirements for these models? And McFedrin, who's unfortunately not here but is from UBC, has some excellent thoughts on this, especially for smaller courses or from courses that aren't STEM courses. And you'll often see a lot of statistics on STEM courses being used because they've got nice big cohorts. We put one person in the classroom to teach and 300 or 500 students. And but when Malcolm Brown and I in a workshop just yesterday were considering, well, how would you use learning analytics for 12 students in a philosophy class? And is there a role for it there? And I think that there might be, but it's often the content and the pedagogy change what that learning might look like and what that role is. There's been this historic tension between adaptable systems and adaptive systems, and I'm sorry if this is rehashing old tensions for people, but adaptable systems are systems where the user says, yes, I want it to do that now, yes, I want it to do that now, and it's a very HCI, human-computer interaction thing. So the conferences that you might read about this at are CHI, adaptive hypermedia, user modeling, etc. Then we have the adaptive systems, which are much cooler. I'm from computer science, you can tell that. Which are much cooler because they're trying to actually just get in there and do it automatically so that people aren't involved. Intelligent tutoring systems, adaptive hypermedia, or sorry, AI and education, educational data mining, and user modeling is actually quite common there. And the tension has been that if a system thinks it's really smart and tries to adapt for you and does a bad job, then you have low satisfaction. If you have to make the human do all the adaptation of the system, then it gets tedious, and it seems like AI should be able to do something more for us there. And of course, both camps have stunning success stories and stunning failures. And so the question of when when a system should be built in one camp versus the other is really quite unclear. So for learning analytics, what should we be considering? And I'm actually going to suggest that we have this kind of angelic figure who might be able to help with that adaptation, who might hold this key to success, the instructional designer. Now, of course, the instructional designer doesn't have to be somebody who's sitting in the learning center who's got the title instructional designer. It can be a keen instructor who has some reflection on their own teaching and learning and so forth. Okay, so here's a little study that we did last year. We reported on it LAK 11. We analyzed student behaviors in a lecture capture system. This was the second year chemistry class that had 600 students in it. We clustered students into 5 different clusters automatically using k-means clustering. And what's really cool is that out of these 5 clusters that came out seemed to be really pedagogically motivated. It was, if you watched every week, you fell in one cluster. If you watched for the first half, you fell in another. If you only watched the midterm or around the midterm date, you fell into that one, and so forth. So these 5 clusters weren't just gibberish, which is kind of what we expected. Clustering isn't always a very happy activity. It's a lot of head scratching, but they were very pedagogically motivated. And then we started to correlate marks, and we found that actually people who fell into one cluster in particular had a much higher average and a statistically significant average on both the midterm and the final exams versus other clusters. So this whole thing took us months to do. We had to determine the attributes that we were interested in clustering. We had to clean data. We had to correlate. We had to run our ANOVAs. We had to scratch our heads a lot and kind of consider, well, what if we changed it this way? What if we use these parameters here? How do we make this activity tractable for somebody who's an instructional designer? And that's really the design that we put forward for this conference, was some thoughts towards how we might make that attractable for such an individual. So here's a picture. This is what our lecture capture system looks like. We've got some slide navigation on the left-hand side. We have some interesting ability to take notes at the bottom, and then we can see our classmates' notes here. It's a very simple educational system, nothing as complex as an LCMS might be. And then at the top, you can see our video. And here's a mock-up of what the instructional designer is able to do. So they have a list of all of the different attributes that are available in the system, marks, viewing habits, so forth. They can just check these as they feel, as they want to essentially test a hypothesis. I think marks and the first 2 weeks of viewing, that's going to tell me who's a good student and who's a bad student, who's a kind of poor student. Now I would like to see, if we use these to cluster, what students would show up there. And so they could just hit this cluster button in the bottom, and they get this nice tree map in the top that says, yeah, 50% of your learners are in one cluster, 25% in another, and so forth. Clicking on these clusters allows you then to see details. Which students are in there? What is their rank in the class? What is their percentage? And helps them to try and understand whether these clusters are indeed pedagogically motivated or not. One of the problems with unsupervised AI methods like clustering is that these clusters don't mean anything by themselves, right? They're just optimally mathematically grouped people based on some sort of attributes. And so we really rely on a human to come and put a useful label. And so if you can see in this bottom right-hand corner, here's a cluster that the instructor has clicked on. They've done some viewing of the different charts of when students have accessed data and who the students are and so forth. And they've been able to ascribe some label to it. Oh, I think these people are reviewers. That to me is some pedagogical trait that I think is valuable. Clusters also are very hierarchical in nature, so drilling down in clusters is an interesting opportunity. You could take this cluster of 50 learners, 89 people, and say, wow, that's interesting. Click on it, view the data, say, oh, these people are all watching my content. I'd be really interested in, sub-clustering these even more. Click on it and start the whole process over again, taking a look at different attributes, using that as your set of individuals. So our goal here is to explore a tool that allows, or to build a tool that allows for exploration by these middle people. I can't remember who spoke to this in the workshops, but they said they're building things for middle people, people who don't have detailed stats knowledge, people who can't write scripts in R to show them data about their class. They just want to get a quick overview. They want to spend 5 minutes exploring their class to see what's interesting there. Once we've got these clusters labeled, then we can go on to the question of adaptation. So here's a mock-up of how we might adapt that previous learning environment. And again, it's just a simple learning environment based on lecture capture. So each of these different features, the slides on the left, the different notes in the bottom right, even the main video player, we just call widgets. And then you can be able to say, click on those widgets and parameterize them. So people who are learning, I want them to see one slide, or people who are reviewing, I want them to see one slide every 30 seconds. Maybe people who haven't watched the lecture at all yet, I don't want them to be able to skip through, or I want to make it harder for them to skip through. I want to focus on having that video really big. Maybe when they're studying for the final exam, or I know they're studying for the final exam, I want to change the layout of the screen so that it emphasizes the note-taking so that they can do that kind of collaborative work with others. You could imagine doing this in a learning content management system as well, parameterizing this to emphasize different aspects of the system that the instructional designer feels is important for particular learning outcomes and learning goals. So, a quick summary. Learning analytics has the potential to help with adaptive systems, and human judgment is necessary to leverage analytics appropriately. And if you listen to Campbell and others, there was a lot of talk in the workshops and a lot of talk in the ELI focus group on learning analytics back about a month about how important it is that humans are in the loop, that when we build a completely automated system that's automated but doesn't have that full picture because it's only got analytics, doesn't have the ability to engage with students in different ways, often we lose some of that judgment and we lose some of that, as Siemens calls it, sense-making ability. And so instructional designers, I think, may have a niche here in that they can be pattern finders and they can be mediators of adaptation. And I think a lot of instructional designers are sitting, looking at analytics saying, okay, what does it mean for me? We see a lot of people in administration saying, this is great, we can mark this and we can track this directly towards how many people are going to graduate and so forth. But how do we make learning analytics a powerful tool for the people who are going to have to do remediation of student problems? And how can we have them help even proactively just browse through and try and explore through the model formation? And so then the question I have at the end, and really the point of this design brief we put together, is that we should be building analytics solutions to help them. And I think right now we haven't been building analytics solutions to help the instructor per se or the instructional designer per se. Often, though, there's a lot of overlap, especially with visualizations, as we get into learning analytics that have a lot more visualization. But our main stakeholders up till this point have been students and have been higher admin. And I think that the opportunity for learning analytics and tools that allow exploration of this rich data set can actually change our teaching and learning as it's happening, as opposed to having to wait and do it after the fact. And that's all I have. That's a wonderful question, Phil. I'm actually really interested in building pattern repositories for learning analytics as well. So to say that I went through in this kind of class and I saw this kind of analytic was very important for me and very useful. And so I want to save it and share it. And you can imagine in a department how many people would do this. So you get last year's course notes, you have to teach intro comp sci, you haven't done that in a long time. You get the course notes, but you also get, hey, these were the top 5 analytics that I thought were really cool. You look at their communication patterns because it's a very social class. This one here will show you a graph, and when the line, peaks and then drops, then you know you've lost their attention span and so forth. And so I think instructors, instructional designers, and then even departments should be able to share these analytics understandings, and not to want to overload the word design, but these designs of remediation and of exploration with one another. We shouldn't all have to start with this blank statistics tool each time. We should be able to look into these repositories of patterns and try and find ones that work for the situations that we have. I hope we'll get to a point where analytics are very available to students, very transparent how our decisions are being made, and I think that that will really focus them on making their own decisions in a better manner. There's a whole body of work, and I've talked to a couple of people at this conference about this, called open learner modeling. And it came out of a lot of the ITS intelligent tutoring work. And it was that ITS's tutors have a model of a learner, and they form that often based on these kind of interactions the learner has with the tutor. And opening that model to the learner can have some really interesting effects on motivation, on their ability to learn, and their annoyance with the system. There's some work specifically by Judy Kay, who looked at scrutable learner modeling that I think is quite interesting. And she argued that not only the visualization should be open to students, but actually the algorithms. If you go back to some of our earlier presentations on how things are being nudged, need to be open to students in a sort of auditing fashion, because they need to understand this is really now almost a formal assessment mechanism. And so they really need to be able to understand those. There's some other interesting work where students have actually argued against their model being formed one way because of external factors. What you didn't realize was my leg was broken. I'm not actually, the athletic scholarship is not a big issue anymore. Now I'm just focusing on my GPA. I should be fine, or something like this. So all of these external factors and the human in the loop can kind of inject those. So I think this kind of tool is almost a little bit of a gateway drug into that. I think it's meant to be so easy to use to explore the analytics of your classroom that it will suck instructional designers into starting to do that. What's been disappointing for me to see in higher ed is instructional designers turning into just web CT monkeys, and all they do is just input data into their LCMS like Blackboard, but they don't actually think about the content, the educational goals, these higher things, often because the instructor has already predetermined all of that. In these cases, I think the instructional designers are some ways being very misused as typists. And I think that there's and I think there's a lot of room for instructional designers to provide some value at this level. They often come with some knowledge of deeper understanding of educational processes, and they'll be able to take a look and say, oh yes, this is where computer-mediated communication is doing wonderful. This is an analytic that's important, whereas others maybe not. One of the challenges here is doing that for 1,000 courses on a campus all of a sudden has a lot of extra employees who aren't faculty. And I'm not sure faculty would all agree that that's the hiring mechanism. I'm hoping these tools will take it for those classes that instructors who are keen and interested, and so they're willing to be the performance artist, and they're willing to go a little bit further, as was the case in our last presentation. This will help make it a little easier for them to get a little bit more mileage out of it without taking away from their research agendas, for instance, or their other teaching duties completely, which we often find with our stellar instructors, that their research agendas are often a little harder for them to maintain.
But you could also imagine that administrators might need to be involved in that as well, because there may be courses that they are particularly interested in having students succeed at, or that are gateway
Strategic,
courses,
yeah, initiatives.
Or, and then also, I think you haven't mentioned the IT department at the university, the people who have the data warehouse, for example, who are able to, know that they have to collect and keep all this data. So I think it's really this team approach.
And the sharing of patterns, I think, is so important. And so once we have this done, that's kind of the next step, is to see if those sharing of patterns really help speed up people's ability to understand and data mine their class. Data mining is actually not terribly hard, but it can be very frustrating if you don't know which questions to ask. And so standing on the shoulders of somebody else is a great way to do it.